Everybody eventually knew something was off. Nobody could put their finger on exactly what. The burgers looked the same. The packaging looked the same. The label said everything it was supposed to say: beef, nothing else. Millions of people had been buying the exact same frozen burgers for years without a second thought, the way you buy milk or bread, a product so ordinary that checking its contents never once crossed anyone's mind. But a food safety lab in Dublin decided to check the one thing nobody had ever bothered to check. Not the taste, not the appearance, the actual DNA. They ran it through frozen beef burgers pulled from supermarket shelves. The results came back, and one sample in particular didn't just fail. It came back as nearly a third horse. Part 1. The number that didn't add up. In December 12, the Food Safety Authority of Ireland ran a routine testing program most consumers never even knew existed, checking whether meat products actually contained what their label claimed. 27 frozen beef burger products went through DNA analysis. The findings were serious enough that the agency spent nearly 2 months quietly retesting everything before announcing anything publicly, because if confirmed, this was going to cause real damage to real companies. On the 15th of January 2013, they announced it anyway. 10 of the 27 products, 37%, tested positive for horse DNA. 23 of them, 85%, tested positive for pig DNA in products that were supposed to contain beef and nothing else. Most of the positive results showed only trace amounts, technically still a labeling failure, but small enough to argue over. One sample did not fall into that category. A Tesco everyday value beef burger came back with horse meat, making up approximately 29% of its content. Not a trace, not an accidental cross-contamination. Nearly a third of the product people were eating was a different animal entirely, sold under a label that said beef and nothing else. Part 2. The pattern that rules out coincidence. Here's what turned this from an isolated lab result into something impossible to explain away. The contaminated products didn't trace back to one factory making one bad batch. They came from 3 separate processing plants: Silvercrest Foods and Liffey Meats in Ireland, and Dalepak Hambleton in North Yorkshire. 2 of those 3, Silvercrest and Dalepak, were both owned by the same parent company, ABP Food Group, one of the largest beef processors anywhere in Europe. If this had been a single freak contamination, you'd expect it to be contained to one plant, one production run, one explanation. Instead, investigators found the same fundamental problem showing up across multiple facilities, multiple supply routes, and, once the full picture emerged, multiple countries. That's not what an isolated accident looks like. That's what a systemic gap in verification looks like, one that had likely existed for a lot longer than anyone wanted to admit, simply because nobody had ever thought to test for it before. Part 3. It wasn't just the burgers. Investigators didn't stop at frozen burgers, and what they found next made the picture significantly harder to contain. 31 separate beef meal products, cottage pies, beef curry pies, and lasagnas were pulled and tested. 21 of them came back positive for pig DNA. Then, within days, the story jumped retailers entirely. Findus, a separate brand sold through major UK supermarkets, had some of its beef lasagne tested independently, and the results were not a trace contamination. Some samples came back as close to 100% horse meat, with no meaningful beef content at all. This was no longer a story about one discount burger at one supermarket. It was a story about an entire category of processed beef products across multiple brands and multiple retailers, where a significant number of items on the shelf were simply not what their packaging claimed them to be. Part 4. The question everyone reasonably asked, and why it didn't hold. The obvious first instinct, for anyone hearing this, is to ask whether the testing itself could be wrong. Lab errors happen. Equipment gets miscalibrated. If that were the explanation here, the story would be very different and much less serious. It didn't hold up. The Irish authorities didn't rely on a single test from a single machine. They ran the analysis, found deeply concerning results, and then spent weeks retesting before going public specifically, because they understood how much was riding on being right. Independent laboratories in multiple countries subsequently ran their own DNA tests on the same and related products, and the core finding held every single time. This wasn't one faulty machine producing one misleading number. It was consistent, reproducible evidence, confirmed independently, that meat sold as beef across multiple well-known retailers was, in a meaningful number of cases, partly or substantially something else. Part 5. The gap nobody had closed. To understand how this happened, you need to understand something most shoppers had never thought about before January 2013. Prepackaged frozen meat products don't get made fresh at the back of your local Tesco. They're manufactured at large industrial processing facilities, often hundreds of miles away, sometimes in a different country entirely, using ingredients sourced from a chain of suppliers that can run through several countries before the final product is ever sealed and labeled. In this case, the trail led back to a filler ingredient, a mixture used to bulk out the burger content, that had been imported from Poland. That filler is where investigators eventually traced the contamination to. Once that ingredient was blended into the burger mixture at the processing plant, sealed and labeled, the product moved through a distribution system exactly the way any other order of frozen burgers would, with nobody at any point in that chain running a DNA test to confirm the label matched the actual contents. Not at the processing plant beyond standard checks. Not at the distribution center. Not at the store. The label said beef, and every part of the system downstream of that first label simply trusted it, all the way to the checkout. This is worth sitting with, because it reveals something about modern food retail that most shoppers genuinely never think about. A supermarket the size of Tesco sells thousands of distinct products, sourced from thousands of different suppliers, each with their own supply chains stretching back through processors, importers, and often several layers of smaller businesses before you ever reach the original farm. No retailer, however large, has the practical ability to personally verify every ingredient in every product on every shelf. The entire system runs on a chain of trust, each link in the chain vouching for the one before it, all the way back to the source. That system works well, the overwhelming majority of the time. But it only takes one weak link, one supplier willing to cut a corner for a cheaper filler ingredient, for that entire chain of trust to carry a false claim all the way to a family's dinner table without a single person along the way necessarily knowing it was happening. As one of the country's own food safety officials put it plainly during the crisis, nobody had ever tested for horse and beef before because nobody expected it to be there. Part 6. What it actually cost. The financial and practical cost of this wasn't measured in one shopper's receipt. It was measured at a completely different scale. Roughly 10 million burgers were pulled from shelves across Tesco, Iceland, Aldi, Lidl and Dunnes stores in the days following the announcement. Tesco's share price fell in the aftermath, wiping a meaningful amount off the company's market value in a matter of days over a product that, on paper, cost a couple of pounds a box. The company took out full-page apology advertisements in national newspapers, a genuinely unusual step for a retailer of that size, telling customers directly that it and its supplier had let them down. Consumer trust surveys conducted in the following months showed a measurable, if temporary, dip in confidence in processed and own brand meat products specifically, exactly the category that had driven so much of the growth in convenience food over the previous decade. And in a detail that made the whole situation even harder to manage cleanly, some of the withdrawn burgers were later found still sitting on shelves in at least one store in Oxford, meaning even the emergency recall itself wasn't executed perfectly the first time. If this is the kind of detail that changes how you look at a supermarket shelf, a like genuinely helps more people see it too. Part 7. The question nobody could fully answer. Underneath the immediate scandal sat a harder, more uncomfortable question that took much longer to work through. Horse meat, at the time, was measurably cheaper to source than beef. A supply chain running through multiple countries, multiple intermediaries, and at least one bulk filler ingredient created exactly the kind of environment where cheaper material can quietly enter a product without the final retailer ever intending it, and without most of the supply chain necessarily even knowing. To be precise about what was and wasn't established, it was confirmed that horse and pig DNA were present in products labeled as pure beef, confirmed across multiple plants and multiple retailers. It was not established at the time or since that Tesco itself, or the other retailers involved, knowingly sold mislabeled meat. The investigation's findings pointed toward the supply chain several layers upstream, toward the ingredient suppliers and the processing plants, rather than at the supermarkets whose names were on the packaging. But that distinction, however important legally, didn't change the basic fact sitting underneath it. The retailers had built their entire relationship with customers on a label they had not personally verified, sourced through a chain long and complex enough that nobody within it had full visibility into where every ingredient had actually come from. Part 8. What happened when the retailers were confronted? Tesco's response, once the results were confirmed, moved fast. The company immediately withdrew all products from the implicated supplier. Tesco's group technical director said directly that the company had pulled everything connected to the supplier in question as soon as the test results came in. Days later, Tesco announced it would become the first UK supermarket to commit to routine DNA testing of its own meat products going forward, a standard that simply had not existed in this form before the scandal broke. The cooperative group and other retailers began canceling supplier contracts with the implicated plants within the same window. None of this was a slow, defensive corporate process. It was a fast, visible scramble to close a gap that had been sitting wide open, undetected, for an unknown length of time before one round of DNA testing happened to catch it. Part 9. The statement that confirmed it. Abi Food Group, the parent company of 2 of the 3 implicated plants, said publicly that it understood the retailer's decisions and confirmed it would begin its own random DNA testing program across all of its facilities in Ireland and Britain going forward. Investigators ultimately traced the contamination toward continental suppliers, identifying the source filler ingredient as having entered the chain through a supplier network reaching into Poland. Ireland's agriculture minister at the time called the situation, in his own words, totally unacceptable, and was equally direct that Europe's food traceability system, one widely considered among the most rigorous in the world, had simply failed to catch this. In the aftermath, the UK government commissioned an independent review into the integrity of the food supply chain, led by the food safety expert Professor Chris Elliott, specifically to work out how a gap this large had gone unnoticed for so long and what would actually be needed to close it permanently. That combination, a highly regarded regulatory system, several major, well-resourced retailers, an entire government review commissioned specifically to fix it, and still a gap wide enough for a third of a product to be the wrong species of meat, is what turned this from a passing news story into something food safety experts still reference more than a decade later. Years later, in 2022, Europol concluded a separate criminal investigation into an illegal horsemeat trafficking network operating across Spain, Belgium, Germany, and Italy, resulting in 41 arrests. The scale of that particular network was smaller than the 2013 crisis, but its existence years afterward made one thing clear to anyone still hoping the original scandal had permanently closed the door. The underlying financial incentive, cheaper meat quietly substituted into a product sold at a higher price, had never actually gone away. It had simply gone quiet for a while. Part 10. The failure nobody had built an alarm for. Here's the uncomfortable structural truth this whole episode exposed. Before January 2013, essentially nobody in the retail food safety system was testing beef products specifically for the presence of horse, not because it was technically difficult, but because nobody had thought it was a plausible enough risk to justify the cost of checking. The entire verification system downstream of the original label was built to catch some categories of failure: bacterial contamination, incorrect weights, expired dates, but not species substitution, because that particular failure mode had never seriously been anticipated. Once you understand that, the real question stops being how did this happen, and becomes what else moves through a supply chain this long, and this layered without anyone specifically testing for it, simply because nobody has yet had a reason to look. Part 11. The pattern that repeated more than once. If the horsemeat scandal had been a one-off, a single, unrepeatable failure fixed permanently by the DNA testing regime that followed, this story might end there. It didn't. In 2017, An undercover investigation by ITV News and The Guardian filmed inside a factory belonging to Two Sisters Food Group. At the time, one of the largest poultry suppliers to UK supermarkets, supplying chicken to Tesco, Sainsbury's, Aldi, Lidl, and Marks and Spencer, among others. The footage allegedly showed workers tampering with slaughter dates to artificially extend how long the meat could be sold as fresh, mixing batches of chicken processed on different days together, and altering the traceability codes on crates, the exact codes that exist specifically to trace a product back to its origin if a food safety problem is ever discovered. Altering those codes doesn't just bend the rules. It breaks the one mechanism regulators rely on to find contaminated product quickly if something goes wrong downstream. Then, 10 years after the original horsemeat crisis, in March 2023, the Food Standards Agency's National Food Crime Unit confirmed it was running a live criminal investigation, codenamed Operation Hawk, into a separate meat supplier accused of systematically passing off foreign pork sourced from South America and continental Europe as British, selling it into the supply chains of major UK supermarkets. Farmers Weekly, the trade publication that first exposed the allegations, reported claims from former employees that the supplier had been washing hams that were visibly spoiled to disguise them, mixing rotting pork with fresh product before further processing, and falsifying safety paperwork covering tests for pathogens including Listeria and E. coli. The FSA's own investigation involved reviewing more than 1 million documents. Products connected to the supplier had been used in ready meals, sandwiches, and quiches sold across the country. Every major UK supermarket chain was asked directly by journalists whether it was the retailer involved, and every single one said no. The Food Standards Agency confirmed the affected retailer had been notified and had removed the implicated products, without publicly naming which chain it was, citing the ongoing legal process. The opposition's shadow environment secretary said at the time that the country had been told the lessons of the horsemeat scandal had already been learned, and that this new investigation cast real doubt on whether that was actually true. 3 separate incidents, a decade apart in places, involving different suppliers, different meat categories, and different specific mechanisms, tampered dates, mislabeled origin, falsified safety records, species substitution. What connects all 3 is not any single company's dishonesty. It's the same structural gap, appearing again and again in a supply chain long enough, and layered enough, that the retailer whose name sits on the final label rarely has full visibility into everything happening several steps upstream. Part 12, the thing a refund and a recall don't fix. Every product pulled from a shelf, every apology advert, every DNA testing program introduced after the fact addresses the immediate failure. None of it fully addresses what actually got damaged, which is the basic, unspoken assumption underneath every single grocery purchase, that the word on the label describes what's actually inside the package. You don't have a lab in your kitchen. You're not testing your own dinner for species authenticity before you cook it. The entire system of modern grocery shopping depends on trusting a label you have no personal way to verify, printed by a company sourced through a chain you cannot see, built on relationships you were never part of. When that trust breaks once publicly at national scale, it doesn't fully repair itself just because the specific products involved get pulled and the specific supplier gets delisted. It leaves behind a small, quiet hesitation that wasn't there before, the kind that resurfaces. For a lot of people, the next time a supermarket's own name turns up in a headline about a supply chain investigation, whatever the actual product happens to be, parents who fed their children beef lasagna without a second thought spent months afterward reading labels they had never previously looked at twice. That's not paranoia. That's a completely rational response to discovering that a system you trusted implicitly had a gap nobody had told you existed. Part 13. The imbalance worth naming. Here's the pattern worth sitting with. UK retailers have invested enormous sums over the past decade in loss prevention, security tagging, CCTV, and increasingly facial recognition, and AI systems specifically designed to catch customers taking something they haven't paid for. That investment is real, continuously updated, and taken extremely seriously at board level. Because retail crime is a large, well-measured, and constantly reported cost line. The verification system's designed to catch the opposite problem. A supplier providing customers with something other than what they paid for have historically been thinner, slower to fund, and more reactive than preventative. Tesco's own DNA testing commitment only began after the crisis broke, not before it. Operation Hawk, a decade later, was only launched after employees inside the implicated supplier chose to become whistleblowers, not because a routine retailer audit caught it first. The Two Sisters Food Group allegations similarly surfaced through undercover journalism, not through a supermarket's own supply chain checks. In every one of these cases, the party that ultimately closed the gap was someone outside the retailer's own verification process entirely: a government lab, a whistleblower, an undercover reporter. The gap keeps closing after the fact rather than before it, and each time, it's an external party that ends up doing the verification work. The supply chain itself was supposed to be doing continuously, quietly in the background, long before any product ever reached a shelf. Part 14. The only question that matters now. Every part of the horsemeat scandal eventually resolved in the way it was supposed to. The contaminated products were pulled. The retailers apologized. Tesco introduced testing that hadn't existed before. Regulations tightened across the country and the wider EU. Viewed narrowly, the system worked. But it only worked because a food safety laboratory happened to run a test nobody had specifically been required to run, and because, a decade later, a small number of employees inside one supplier were willing to risk their jobs to report what they'd seen. Neither of those things is a reliable, repeatable safeguard. They are what happens when the official verification system has a gap large enough that closing it depends on who happens to notice, and whether they're willing to speak up. The structural question underneath both of these stories is the same one. If the label is created far upstream, the money changes hands at the till, and no consistent, mandatory check exists in between confirming that what's printed matches what's inside, then every customer trusting that label is absorbing a risk they never agreed to and have no way to see coming. A food industry worth billions of pounds, running some of the most sophisticated logistics and inventory systems in the country, should be capable of closing a gap that, twice now, a decade apart, has only been closed after the fact by people entirely outside the system meant to prevent it in the first place. Has this changed how you look at what's actually inside the pack? The next time you're standing in that aisle, tell me below. I read every comment.